Everyone loves the battalions for getting a few cheap command points, so let's see which factions can get them the easiest. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Yesterday's video we're going to be looking at every single faction in 40k that can muster a battalion, so that's 2 HQs and 3 troops, and seeing which ones pay the very least points for each of these. Having access to very cheap formations where you can basically rustle up a few command points if you have a few points spare in your list can be really handy if you want to support some bigger, heavier hitting units in the bulk of your army, so any armies that have access to these while the units are still achieving something decent on the table certainly have a little bit of a leg up competitive wise. Before we start, I'll challenge you to guess the least and most expensive of the battalions available, and see if you know how many points your cheapest battalion costs. So without further ado, let's get into it, and let's talk through some of the options. First up we have the Space Marines, with their battalion being 255 points. Tech Marines are the cheapest HQ that Space Marines have access to, at 45 points when armed with chainswords, and then 3 squads of cheap scouts, which are very handy units for gumming up the midfield and scoring objectives. Now, I'm not sure you necessarily want 2 Tech Marines unless you've got some decent vehicles to support, although you could potentially make one the Master of the Forge and Master of Machines to make him an awesome buffing character for vehicles as well. In terms of near misses, Sergeant Kronos is technically 30 points for the Ultramarines, so it could have been a bit cheaper, but you do need to have a vehicle to field him in, somewhere else in your army. So technically if you're an Ultramarines player and you already have a vehicle in your list, then this could be a slightly cheaper Space Marine formation. Other near HQs are 60 points for a Lieutenant, which might be a bit more useful than a second Tech Marine, and Sergeant Telion, who is 65. I think it's worth mentioning that Tactical Marines are also 60 points now and do compete decently with the Scouts, depending on whether you want that really nice forward deployment or you'd rather have a bit of power armour on the go. If we look at the other first founding chapters now, unfortunately Blood Angels and Dark Angels don't get quite as cheap a brigade. They have to pay a little bit more for their Tech Marines, as there's no option to replace the power axe with a chainsword in their codexes. Again, their troops' choice are going to be Scouts. I thought it was worth noting that Tycho the Lost is also fairly close in terms of low point HQs, so he's another reasonably cheap option. Space Wolves, however, are significantly more expensive, with their cheapest battalion being 300 points. Their Tech Marine equivalent is the Iron Priest, who comes with Tempest Hammer and Hellfrost pistol at base, and he costs you 67 points, so a little bit more expensive, but you do get a freaking Thunderhammer equivalent as part of that, so it's not bad at all really. It does however mean that their cheapest HQ is a Wolfguard Battle Leader, their equivalent of a Lieutenant, and then either Blood Claws or Grey Hunters are both 60 points a pop, as of course their Wolf Scouts aren't in troops, they're in the elite section. Moving on to the other power armoured folks, first up we have the Deathwatch, whose cheapest battalion is 2 Chaplains and a unit of bare bones veterans when given close combat weapons and bolt pistols, as they have to pay a bit extra for their bolters as they're full of that very nice special issue ammunition. Realistically, Deathwatch battalions aren't something you can skimp on too much. You're always going to be wanting to upgrade to special issue ammunition, and the Watch Captain is just 2 points more than the Chaplain, so they're definitely one of the armies that gains a lot from a little bit more investment than this. Grey Knight's cheapest HQ is a Tech Marine again, although you do have to pay the full servo harness for him. Interestingly, being a Grey Knight, he also gets the advantage of being a Psyker, which gives you really quite an interesting little HQ choice. He's reasonably fighty with those extra guns on the servo arm, he can fix up some vehicles, and of course he can either smite away or buff other Grey Knights near him. Castellan Crow is 80 points, so he's another near miss if you want a special character. Of course he has his sword that he doesn't use, which means he doesn't pay much for his close combat stats. Their cheapest troops choice is a Strike Squad bearing Force Falchions, and they're 80 points a pop, meaning that they have a rather expensive battalion at 392. Next we come up to the Adeptus Custodes, who have a ridiculously expensive battalion. Their very cheapest shield captains are just armed with a Sentinel Blade and nothing else, 497 points, though in reality you would pretty much always at least upgrade to the Storm Shield as well. Their cheapest troops are the Custodian Guard, armed only with spears, which means that just for your 5 command points, even if you spend absolutely nothing else, then you're going to be looking at 635 points. I think this is one of the reasons why Custodes players often bring some guardsmen along for a loyal 32 or something. Talking of the Imperial Guard, they have an incredibly cheap battalion indeed at 151 points for the absolute bare minimum. This can be achieved by a very weird selection of units, including 2 Death Corps of Krieg field officers and 3 Scion squads. The field officers are basically the same as platoon commanders but for the Death Corps, so don't have 2 orders and pay less than they would for the standard company commanders. Of course, as an alternative to this, the Loyal 32, with their standard 180 points for 2 company commanders and 3 infantry squads, is absolutely excellent and provides you some really good utility for how many points you invest in them, as well as those lovely command points. If you wanted to make the Scions work better as well, you could also include Tempesta Primes instead of the Field Officers. 2 Tempesta Primes and 3 Scion squads are 175. Either way, it's very cheap, and there's a reason why Guard are often allied in for command points. Moving on to the Admech now, and they're not in too dissimilar position to the Guard. Their Tepris engine seers are 30 points, and their Ranger squads have dropped to 35 as of a previous chapter approved. This means that the cheapest battalion that they can muster is 165 points, and is another very solid option indeed, particularly if you have things like Imperial Knights where the Tepris engine seers can help fix them up. A cheap battalion like this could also give you the chance to buy in some of those excellent transuranic arquebuses for some decent sniping potential. The Sisters of Battle have a 218 point battalion, which is a bit of an interesting one because you can only take 1 missionary per detachment, so their cheapest formation is actually 1 missionary, 1 canoness and 3 squads of battle sisters. This actually makes them a little bit more well-rounded, as they'll be both getting reroll 1s and extra attacks in close combat, so they'll be a little bit better at repelling the enemy than normal. Moving on to the followers of the Dark Gods now. First of all, we have the Chaos Space Marine Battalion, which has 2 quite cheap HQs in the Warpsmith and the Master of Executions, who we can see here. The Warpsmith can help fix up some vehicles and has a little bit of decent close range firepower, and the Master of Executions is just a generic decent fighty character, who's particularly good at chopping up characters without acts of dismemberment. Dark Apostles and Chaos Lords are only a little bit more than this, so also worth considering. And it's Cultists for the Troops choice for 40 points apiece, which still beats out the 55 point Chaos Marines. Overall, they get a battalion of 240 points. Next up we have the Thousand Sons, who instead of having Lords or any of the above, they have Sorcerers, meaning they're a little bit more expensive at 296, and again the Cultists massively beat out Zangors or Rubric Marines. For the Death Guard, most of their HQs are actually really quite expensive, the cheapest being the Chaos Lord, and again he's backed up by Cultists, giving a 268 point battalion. Moving into the other various Chaos factions now, first of all Chaos Demons can get very cheap indeed, although it does involve some weird mixing and matching with a couple of Heralds of Slaanesh and 3 squads of Brimstone Horrors. The Horrors are excellent for filling battalions, being only 30 points apiece, and can be good little nuisance units just to sit on backfield objectives while doing literally nothing else. The next cheapest HQ is the Bloodmaster at 56 points, who does his normal Herald things and is just a generically slightly fighty Bloodletter equivalent. I believe if you wanted to go mono god, then I believe it would still be Tzeentch winning out due to those Brimstone Horrors, backed up by Heralds of Tzeentch or Changecasters as they're now called. And second it will be the Slaanesh detachment with the Heralds and the Demonettes. Renegades and Heretics from the Forge World list actually have the cheapest Chaos Battalion at 170 points. This gets you 2 Renegade Commanders and 3 squads of Militia or Mutant Rabble as you should feel. They really are just directly inferior to the Loyal 32, those Renegade Commanders can't issue orders, and the Militia and Mutant Rabble just don't hit anywhere near as well as their Guard equivalents. It's very much subpar compared with the Loyal 32, but it does net you 5 points for cheap in a Chaos Battalion if that's what you need. Finally, we have an interesting one in the Servants of the Abyss. These are the guys from Blackstone Fortress, including the Traitor Commissar release that they had later in the year. 194 points gets you 2 Traitor Commissars with Power Fists. They aren't spectacular, but they do have at least a small amount of fighting power, and in the troop section you can take 1 squad of Beastmen, which are just 4 models for 24 points, and then to fill out the other 2 slots you can either take Traitor Guardsmen or Cultists of the Abyss. They both cost 5 points a model for 7 models, but they do come baked in with some slightly interesting gear, such as flamers or grenade launchers or heavy stubbers. I'm not really sure that they're worth passing up the raw bodies that you get in the Renegades and Heretics formation, but they're certainly an interesting little oddity in a battalion that you can field that's outside the normal 40k rules. Moving on to some Xenos now, and we have the Eldari forces here. The Craft Worlds can achieve a 234 point battalion using 2 Warlocks and 3 squads of Storm Guardians, which just make the cut due to them being available in squads of 8. The Rangers and Dire Rangers aren't so far off for troops either, and could well be more useful. For their Darkkin, the Drukhari can manage an 198 point force, though it does involve mixing between the different detachments, taking 2 Succubi and 3 sets of Cabalite Warriors. Again, I think in reality, you're always going to field them as a set of a Cabalite detachment, and take 2 Archons instead for just 5 points more a pop, as they actually have some synergy with the Cabalites and are still a 208 point battalion. Harlequins, however, are far more expensive, with their troop masters being 60 points each and their troops being 55 points, even when you give none of them any decent combat gear at all. I really think that Harlequin troops could either use a bit of a points cut or some increased abilities, to be honest. Finally, we get to the remaining 5 Xenos factions, of which the cheapest battalion goes to the Tau, with 2 Cadre Fireblades and 3 squads of Strike Squads or Breachers. This really isn't too bad in a little battalion, as Fireblades give you some additional marker lights, and the others just give you a few more pulse shots and extra bodies for objectives, so I think that the Tau do pretty well out of this contest. The Necrons tend to come in big, more expensive units, however, so their Lords will cost 58 points, and their minimum squads of Immortals will cost you 75, meaning that you're at least paying for a 341 point battalion. Moving over to the Tyranids, we have the Tyranid Primes for the HQ at 70 points apiece, again with no special war gear or anything, and Ripper Swarms for the troops, who are excellent little OBSEC harassment units. I think again in reality you might want to upgrade the Primes to be Neurothropes perhaps, as they're only about 20 points more apiece, but the Ripper Swarms can definitely give you some really good abilities for the high fleets to be able to hang on to some objectives. The Genestealer Cults are also quite cheap, with 53 point Acolyte Icon Wards for HQ choices, although they do have a number of fairly cheap other ones such as Primuses and Majesties, and you can fill out their troops with cheap Acolyte hybrids or upgrade to the slightly more expensive Brood Brothers, who are essentially 40 point Imperial Guard infantry squads. Finally, we come to the Orcs, where actually the cheapest battalion uses the new revamped custom force field mech from Saga of the Beast, who rules as written now is 55 points, as they forgot to charge for the custom force field, which was an extra 20 points in the index. As it stands at the time of recording, however, the Orcs can achieve some very good force field governance, and combine it with a few squads of cheap Gretchen for a 200 point battalion. Another decent pick for a low-cost HQ is of course the Weird Boy, who's a staple in most Orc lists due to being able to jump Orc boys all over the map, and make either big squads of boys or the war boss hit a bit harder. So overall, our 5 top cheapest brigades are Imperial Guard first, then Admech, Renegades and Heretics, Tau, then Chaos Demons. Although I will admit that some of those formations are considerably better than others. I do understand that in real armies, you're also going to have to be looking at the value that you get out of these units for the points, rather than taking things that have absolutely no synergy together whatsoever. On the most expensive side of things, it's unsurprisingly the Custodes who win this, being a full 240 points more than the Grey Knights, and then Deathwatch, Necrons and Thousand Suns complete the list. So I hope you've enjoyed this little list of cheapest battalions per faction. Sometimes I think it can be quite handy, as it means you can think of what's the absolute bare bones for the detachment, and then decide how you want to spend your points to upgrade the forces from there. Thanks very much for listening to another Auspex Tactics video. If you've enjoyed, feel free to subscribe for more 40k content, coming pretty much every day. And if you've been enjoying my videos recently, then the channel does have a Patreon page, which is what keeps these videos coming. If you've been enjoying regularly, then any support is absolutely greatly appreciated, as it does take quite a long time to record these, and being a member of the Patreon page does allow you to see some early videos, vote on polls for what's coming next in the channel, and enter into the occasional prize draw where I post out some free miniatures. If any of that sounds interesting, then the link's in the description below, feel free to give it a look, and as always a massive thank you to my current Patreons for helping keep this channel going. In any case, thank you for listening, I'll hope to see you guys next time.